Burt Lancaster names the most sinister actors of Hollywood's golden age. But these aren't the stars you'd expect. Behind the glitz and glamour, some of Hollywood's biggest names hid dark secrets and ruthless behavior. Today, we're diving into the shocking truths Burt Lancaster quietly revealed about the hidden villains of the silver screen. In the golden era of Hollywood, few stars commanded the screen with the magnetic presence of Burt Lancaster. With his athletic build, piercing blue eyes, and a smile that could disarm even the most skeptical critic, Lancaster wasn't just an actor. He was a force of nature. But behind that captivating facade lay a man of complexities, contradictions, and controversies that often mirrored the very characters he portrayed. Born in 1913 in New York City, Lancaster's early life was as dynamic as his film roles. He was a circus acrobat, a military man, and eventually a self-made movie star. His breakout role in The Killers, 1946, showcased not just his acting prowess, but also his willingness to delve into the darker aspect of human nature. This inclination towards complex characters became a hallmark of his career. Yet, Lancaster's off-screen persona was equally compelling. He was known for his fiery temper, unyielding principles, and a penchant for challenging the status quo. Colleagues admired his dedication, but often found themselves at odds with his domineering nature. Stories from film sets frequently highlighted his intense involvement in every aspect of production, sometimes leading to clashes with directors and co-stars. One such instance was during the filming of Sweet Smell of Success, 1957, where Lancaster's portrayal of the ruthless columnist J.D. Hunsaker was eerily reminiscent of his own reputation in Hollywood. The film's production was fraught with tension, with reports of Lancaster's overbearing influence causing friction among the crew. Despite the turmoil, the movie stands today as a testament to his commitment to authentic storytelling. Lancaster's relationships within the industry were a tapestry of camaraderie and conflict. His dynamic with fellow actor Kirk Douglas is particularly noteworthy. The two shared the screen multiple times, their chemistry undeniable. However, their off-screen interactions were a blend of mutual respect and intense rivalry. Lancaster's sharp wit and penchant for teasing often tested Douglas's patience, leading to moments of genuine tension between the two legends. Beyond the silver screen, Lancaster was a man deeply involved in political activism. He was an outspoken advocate for civil rights and took bold stances against the Vietnam War and the death penalty. His activism wasn't without consequences. He found himself under the scrutiny of the FBI and was even listed on President Nixon's infamous enemies list. Yet, Lancaster remained undeterred, using his platform to champion causes he believed in. As we delve deeper into the life and times of Burt Lancaster, it becomes evident that his story is not just about a Hollywood star, but about a man who navigated the complexities of fame, personal convictions, and the ever-evolving landscape of American cinema. Next, we'll explore the intricate dynamics of his relationship with Kirk Douglas, shedding light on how their interactions shaped some of Hollywood's most memorable moments. When two titans of the silver screen share the spotlight, the result is either cinematic magic or a backstage powder keg. In the case of Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, it was both. Their on-screen chemistry was undeniable, but off-screen, that's where things got messy. They were Hollywood's favorite odd couple. Lancaster was a rugged idealist with a temper that could ignite a room. Douglas, the intense perfectionist with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove. Together, they co-starred in 7 films, including iconic titles like Gunfight, At the OK Corral, and 7 Days in May. But their working relationship was never as smooth as it seemed. On camera, Lancaster often played the dominant character. Cool, composed, in control. Off camera, he carried that same energy into real life, often clashing with Douglas over everything from script notes to billing order. Lancaster once referred to Douglas as that little guy, a jab at Douglas's well-known sensitivity about his height. It might have been meant as a joke, but to Douglas, it stung, and he never forgot it. What fueled their rivalry wasn't just personality, it was power. Both men were fiercely independent. Both had formed their own production companies, Hecht Hill Lancaster and Brenner Productions, giving them more control than most actors of the time. And both were known for pushing boundaries, challenging directors, and demanding excellence. But when two alphas try to lead the same pack, tension is inevitable. During the making of The Devil's Disciple, 1959, the two reportedly argued constantly. Lancaster, ever the physical performer, thought Douglas was too stiff. Douglas, in turn, accused Lancaster of grandstanding and overshadowing his scenes. Despite, or perhaps because of, their bickering, the film worked. Critics praised their explosive chemistry. But behind the scenes, the relationship was fraying. And yet, in a strange twist, the rivalry helped elevate them both. Lancaster's confidence brought out a grittier edge in Douglas. Douglas's seriousness challenged Lancaster to go deeper. In many ways, they were the perfect counterbalance. They didn't like each other much, but they made each other better. Later in life, both men looked back on their time together with a mixture of admiration and irritation. Lancaster once said, "We fought like hell, but we respected each other's talent." Douglas, always more blunt, admitted that while he admired Lancaster's abilities, he never really trusted him. Still, the legacy they built together is undeniable. In an era where studio heads ruled and actors followed orders, Lancaster and Douglas were rebels, powerful, opinionated, and fiercely committed to their craft. Their films didn't just entertain, they shook the system. But this was only one of Lancaster's many battlegrounds. His clashes weren't limited to co-stars. Directors, producers, even entire studios felt the heat of his presence. And as his fame grew, so did his need to control the narrative, both on screen and off. Coming up next, we dig into the set of Sweet Smell of Success, where Lancaster's drive for perfection turned production into something darker than anyone expected. By the mid-1950s, Burt Lancaster wasn't just a star, he was a storm. And nowhere was his intensity more deeply felt than on the set of Sweet Smell of Success. The 1957 film has since become a noir classic, but behind the camera, the production nearly fell apart under the pressure of Lancaster's commanding presence. In the film, Lancaster plays J.J. Hunsaker, a vicious newspaper columnist who manipulates and destroys lives from behind his typewriter. It was one of his darkest, most chilling roles, and many in Hollywood whispered that it wasn't much of a stretch from his real personality. Cold, calculated, controlling. Lancaster didn't just act in the film, he co-produced it. And when Burt co-produced something, it meant one thing: total control. He was involved in casting, writing decisions, even camera angles. Director Alexander McKendrick, a refined and quiet Brit, found himself overwhelmed by Lancaster's energy. The actor would shout across the set, demand retakes, and dismiss ideas mid-scene if they didn't fit his vision. At times, it felt less like a film shoot and more like surviving a storm. Actors and crew whisper about his temper. One minute he'd be cracking jokes, the next, slamming scripts on the ground and demanding rewrites. The pressure didn't just affect morale. It seeped into the film itself. The tension, the darkness, the sense of doom hanging over every scene. It all felt too real. It was as if the chaos behind the scenes had leaked onto the screen. And yet, ironically, that chaos helped Sweet Smell of Success become what it was: a cinematic gut punch. Critics were stunned by Lancaster's transformation. Gone was the romantic hero of earlier films. In his place stood a monster in a tuxedo, cold, cruel, and eerily believable. It was one of his most powerful performances, and one of his most disturbing. But not everyone walked away impressed. Screenwriter Clifford Odets reportedly butted heads with Lancaster constantly. Scenes were rewritten on the fly. Schedules changed without warning. Odets once described the production as an emotional battlefield, and he wasn't exaggerating. Some crew members vowed never to work with Lancaster again. For Lancaster, though, the ends justified the means. He wanted authenticity. He wanted power. He wanted perfection. And he got it at a cost. The film tanked at the box office initially. Audiences weren't ready for a version of Lancaster so vile and unsympathetic. But over time, critics came around. Decades later, Sweet Smell of Success would be hailed as one of the greatest films of its genre. Still, the scars left on the production lingered. It was one of many projects where Lancaster's relentless drive left broken relationships in its wake. And it raised a question that would follow him for the rest of his career. Was Burt Lancaster a genius or just a tyrant? Next, we step off the soundstage and into the streets, where Lancaster's real-life controversy spilled into the public eye, revealing a side of him few fans ever saw. Fame can polish a reputation, but it can't hide everything. And for Burt Lancaster, no amount of box office gold could completely shield him from the whispers that started early in his career, and only grew louder as he climbed higher. Because while he played heroes and martyrs on screen, behind the scenes, there was a darker, more volatile version of the man that Hollywood didn't know how to handle. Lancaster had a reputation for being difficult, not in the charming, misunderstood genius way, but in the stormy, combative, walk on eggshells way. People who worked with him either admired his passion or feared his wrath, and in some cases, both. There were murmurs about his treatment of women, stories that never made it to the press but circulated quietly behind closed doors. He was charming, no doubt. Women found him magnetic, but that magnetism reportedly came with a possessive, sometimes aggressive edge. One account from a crew member on a late 50s production alleged that Lancaster became furious when a female co-star rejected his advances, and that his behavior on set changed dramatically afterward. Tension soared, scenes were red-hot, and the actress's role was mysteriously cut down in the final edit. There was also an incident, rarely spoken publicly, in which Lancaster was said to have struck a woman after a heated argument in private. No police report, no public fallout, just a quiet reshuffling of schedules and a few conveniently canceled interviews. Whether it happened exactly as whispered or not, the cloud of rumor never left him, and Hollywood, always adept at cleaning up after its own, moved on. But the people who saw it, they remembered. Then came the accusations of intimidation. Lancaster wasn't known for being physically violent on set, but emotionally, that's another story. He could tear down a younger actor with a single comment. He could freeze out a director just by showing up late and staying silent. It was a subtle kind of power play, the kind you don't notice until morale has collapsed and the production is bleeding money. And yet, despite it all, Lancaster remained untouchable. Why? Because he delivered. Because when he stood in front of camera, he didn't just act, he hypnotized. Studio heads forgave his outbursts. Audiences forgot the rumors. And reporters? Well, they didn't dare ask the wrong questions. Not back then. But his behavior wasn't just about ego. It came from somewhere deeper. Maybe a need for control. Maybe a fear of failure. Or maybe just a belief that greatness required domination. That to create something unforgettable, someone had to be broken in the process. Still, as Lancaster's star rose, so did the scrutiny. He wasn't just a celebrity anymore. He was becoming a political lightning rod, too. And while the studios could handle bad press, the federal government, that was a whole other story. Next, we dive into the shadowy chapters of his life, when Lancaster's politics and activism put him on a watch list, and the FBI began keeping tabs on Hollywood's golden boy. Hollywood in the 1950s wasn't just about red carpets and big premieres. It was a battleground. Beneath the glamour, a war was brewing, one of ideology, fear, and surveillance. And standing right in the middle of it, defiantly unafraid, was Burt Lancaster. Unlike many of his peers, Lancaster wasn't content to keep his head down and play it safe. He had opinions, strong ones, and he didn't care who knew it. Civil rights, nuclear disarmament, labor rights, he spoke out about them all. But it was his outspoken criticism of American foreign policy and his alignment with left-leaning activists that caught the government's eye. And soon, the FBI was watching. It started quietly. A flag speech here, a monitored meeting there. But when Lancaster publicly opposed the House Un-American Activities Committee, the same committee responsible for blacklisting dozens of writers and actors suspected of communist sympathies, the government took notice. They didn't dare go after him directly. He was too famous, too powerful. But they took notes. They opened a file. And they watched. One entry in his FBI file described him as a charismatic influence with radical leanings. Another noted that he had frequent contact with known subversives. What they couldn't document, though, was just how committed he was. Because Lancaster didn't just attend protests or sign petitions. He funded movements. He marched. He gave speeches that made the room go silent, even when doing so meant alienating fans and risking his career. But unlike many who were blacklisted or quietly erased from the industry, Lancaster remained bulletproof. Why? One word: leverage. He was a box office draw, a producer, a headline. Studios needed him more than they feared the backlash. And so, while others were blacklisted for far less, Lancaster kept working, kept winning, kept speaking. Still, the pressure wore on him. Friends stopped answering his calls. Projects mysteriously fell through. At one point, a high-profile director withdrew from a film at the last second, reportedly due to political tension. Lancaster never publicly blamed anyone, but the message was clear. The walls were closing in. He also made enemies inside the industry. Quiet ones. People who smiled in meetings but whispered behind closed doors. People who thought stars should entertain, not agitate. And for every award he won, for every hit film, there was always someone waiting to remind him that he wasn't invincible. But that's the thing about Burt Lancaster. He never wanted to be invincible. He wanted to be heard. And that meant pushing past the limits of what Hollywood found acceptable. Still, the pressure cooker of fame, politics, and power doesn't stay sealed forever. And as Lancaster aged, the cracks began to show in his work, in his relationships, and especially in the secrets he kept buried. Because while he spent years calling out corruption and injustice in others, some would say he wasn't nearly as honest about the demons in his own closet. Next up, we turn to the one topic Lancaster always dodged, even in his most revealing interviews: the rumors that followed him for decades and the double life he may have been desperate to keep hidden. Burt Lancaster was many things: Oscar winner, political firebrand, box office giant. But the one thing he never wanted to be: vulnerable. And yet, behind the scenes, that's exactly where he lived much of his life. Shrouded in secrecy, ducking questions, and deflecting rumors that refuse to die. The whispers started early in his career. Quiet suggestions that Lancaster might not have been entirely the man his public image portrayed. Hollywood, even in its golden age, was a breeding ground for secrets. But this was different. These weren't just your average off-screen flings or power moves. The rumors went deeper. They questioned his identity, his desires, and the double life some insisted he was living. For years, there were claims, carefully worded and often denied, that Lancaster may have had relationships that went far beyond the heteronormative standards of the time. Relationships with men. Nothing was ever confirmed. No photos, no official exposés. But the whispers were persistent. Some claimed his long-time friendships with certain male colleagues were unusually intense. Others pointed to his fierce overreaction when journalists asked questions about his private life. Once reportedly threatening to walk out of an interview when asked about his rumored connection to a male co-star. What's more telling is how hard he worked to maintain control over his image. He was fiercely private, even paranoid at times. Friends were chosen carefully. Public appearances were calculated. And behind that perfect smile and commanding voice was a man constantly guarding the gates. In old Hollywood, this wasn't just about personal pride, it was survival. Being outed could end a career overnight. Lancaster knew this. He'd seen it happen to others. And while he never publicly acknowledged anything outside the carefully crafted narrative of a rugged leading man, those close to him hinted there was more beneath the surface. One biographer delicately phrased it as a complexity of personal identity he refused to unpack. Another put it more bluntly: Burt knew who he was. He just couldn't afford for anyone else to know. It's possible that all of it was just rumor, a side effect of being a powerful private figure in an industry obsessed with tearing down its icons. But even if none of it was true, the fear instilled in Lancaster was very real. He trusted almost no one, kept his emotions close, and as he got older, that isolation only deepened. In the final decades of his life, Lancaster began withdrawing from the spotlight. Not because the star was fading, but because he was tired. Tired of the cameras. Tired of the questions. Tired of guarding a life he never felt safe enough to fully live. But there was one part of his legacy he refused to let go of: his pursuit of truth on screen. He dove headfirst into darker, more brutal roles in his later years. And that's where the mask really started to crack. Coming up next, we explore the roles that mirrored his internal battles, and how Lancaster may have used the screen to confess the parts of himself he never could in real life. As Burt Lancaster moved into the later years of his career, something changed, not just in the way he looked, but in the way he acted. The roles became more stripped down, more brutal, more personal. Gone were the glossy heroes and sword-wielding adventurers. In their place were broken men, lost souls, and aging titans haunted by their pasts. And if you watched closely, it felt like Lancaster wasn't just playing characters anymore. He was bleeding through them. Take Atlantic City in 1980. Lancaster plays Lou, a washed-up gangster clinging to a fantasy version of his youth. The character is fragile but proud, stuck in the past, desperate for relevance. And while critics praise the performance as one of Lancaster's best, those who knew him best saw something deeper: a man playing himself. The lines between fiction and reality blurred. You couldn't tell where Lou ended and Burt began. This wasn't just acting, it was therapy on film. Every scene felt like an unspoken confession. The longing, the regret, the silent admission that maybe he hadn't been the hero in his own story. Maybe he had made enemies, hurt people, lied to himself more than he lied to anyone else. Lancaster never admitted this, of course. In interviews, he kept things light, brushing off talk of personal parallels. But on set, there were moments when he'd pause mid-take and just stare. Not at the camera, not at the director, just somewhere far off. Like he was remembering something he couldn't say out loud. Field of Dreams came next. A small role, quiet, dignified. But when he spoke those lines, we just don't recognize the most significant moments of our lives while they're happening. You felt it, not as a character, as a man looking back at the wreckage behind him and wondering if any of it had been worth it. And it wasn't just audiences who noticed the shift. Co-stars began commenting on how different Lancaster had become. Softer, less demanding, less interested in being the center of attention. It was as if the mask had finally slipped, and for the first time in decades, he was letting the world see who he really was. But this transformation didn't come without pain. Lancaster was aging in an industry that worships youth. He struggled with illness, suffered a stroke, and found himself sidelined from the very world he once dominated. Roles dried up, friends passed on, and the spotlight, once so blinding, slowly faded. Still, his final performances weren't just a career winding down. They were a quiet reckoning, a man confronting his past through his art, hoping maybe, just maybe, the screen could say what he never dared to. Next, we dig into the enemies he made along the way, names he reportedly called out in private as the true monsters of Hollywood's golden age. For a man as famously private as Burt Lancaster, what he chose to speak about in his final years said everything. He never wrote a tell-all memoir, never sat down for a confessional interview. But behind closed doors with people he trusted, he didn't hold back, especially when the topic turned to the dark side of old Hollywood. And according to multiple insiders, there were certain names he never let go of, names he associated with manipulation, cruelty, and power abused without consequence. One of those names was Harry Cohn, the infamous head of Columbia Pictures. Cohn ruled his studio like a mob boss, feared by actors and executives alike. Lancaster reportedly despised him, not just for the way he treated women on his casting couches, but for the culture of silence and fear he fostered. He thought he was untouchable, Lancaster once told a friend, but everyone knew what he was. There were even rumors Lancaster once walked off a deal purely because Cohn was attached. Another name that surfaced? Errol Flynn. While Flynn was idolized for his swashbuckling roles, Lancaster supposedly saw him as the embodiment of Hollywood's sickest indulgences. There were long-circulated rumors about Flynn's off-screen behavior, some so dark they were buried by studio lawyers. Lancaster believed the stories, and he reportedly once called Flynn the kind of man who'd smile while he ruined you. But perhaps the most chilling accusation came not against a star or a studio executive, but a beloved director. Though the name has never been confirmed publicly, Several biographers say Lancaster confided that this director, widely celebrated even today, had covered up incidents of abuse on his sets. Lancaster said he confronted him once, only to be told, "That's not your business, Burt. This is how the industry works." That moment, he claimed, changed how he saw the business forever. He never went public with any of this, not in interviews, not in award speeches, but his anger simmered, and those close to him said he carried it to the grave, not because he was afraid of backlash. Lancaster had faced worse, but because he knew the system would never let the truth come out unless it served someone else's narrative. He wasn't naive. He understood that the same system that made him a star had destroyed others, silenced them, exploited them, and he felt complicit because he had played the game, because he had protected his own secrets while watching others fall. And that guilt, it followed him. You could hear it in the quiet moments of his later films. You could see it in the interviews where he dodged the past. He never named names on the record, but in private, he named more than a few. Next, we take a look at the final chapter of Lancaster's life, how he faded from the public eye, the quiet ending few expected, and the final, haunting words that still echo through the midst of old Hollywood. By the late 1980s, Burt Lancaster was no longer the fiery force storming across screens in armor, courtroom suits, or revolutionary uniforms. The thunder had quieted, the fire dimmed, and the man who once wrestled lions on film and studios in real life began slipping quietly into the background. It started with a stroke in 1990. It was sudden, severe, and silencing. Lancaster lost his ability to speak clearly and was partially paralyzed. For a man who had built his career and persona on charisma, physical presence, and commanding words, it was a cruel twist of fate. Overnight, he was no longer in control of the narrative. Others would tell his story from here on out. He withdrew almost completely from public life. No more red carpets, no interviews, no award ceremonies. He became a ghost of sorts, watching the industry evolve from behind closed doors while quietly managing his declining health. But even in his silence, Lancaster remained intensely private. Only a few close friends were allowed into his inner circle during those final years, and they all described the same version of him: reflective, still sharp beneath the health issues, and occasionally overcome with waves of regret. He didn't talk much about fame. He didn't dwell on the Oscars or the glory days. What he wanted to discuss, according to those who sat beside his bed, were people he admired, people he wronged, people he missed, and, most curiously, people who never got their justice. One longtime friend, speaking years after Lancaster's death, said the actor had become obsessed with unfinished business. He kept files, clippings, and notes in boxes, not about himself, but about others, names from the blacklist, actresses whose careers were derailed, contract he wished he hadn't signed. It was like he was building a private history of Hollywood, the friend said. Not the one you see in books, but the one that actually happened. Some believe he intended to go public with it all, that he'd been preparing to name names, reveal details, maybe even film one last project that told the real story of the industry he once ruled. But the stroke stole that chance. When Lancaster passed away in 1994, it wasn't in some grand Hollywood send-off. No blockbuster tribute, no parade of stars. Just a quiet death in his Los Angeles home, surrounded by a few family members and friends. No funeral, no public memorial. It was exactly the way he wanted it. But in the days and weeks that followed, strange stories began to surface. People claiming he had left behind letters. Others insisting he had recorded tapes, confessions, accusations, memories, stored somewhere, locked away from the public. If they exist, they've never been released. And those closest to him have either denied their existence or gone silent altogether. What we do know is this: Burt Lancaster, the man who rose from a street kid in New York to one of Hollywood's most powerful stars, didn't go out with a bang. He exited on his own terms. Quiet, controlled, and still guarding his secrets. But was at the end of the story, or just the part he allowed us to see? Next, in our final section, we look back at the myth, the man, and the lingering question Lancaster left behind. Who was he really? And what truths did he take with him to the grave? By the time Burt Lancaster passed away in 1994, the world had already begun rewriting his story. Obituaries called him the last great lion of old Hollywood. Film retrospectives painted him as the quintessential American tough guy with a golden heart. And younger audiences, unfamiliar with the man behind the legacy, remembered him mostly as the older doctor from Field of Dreams, a soft-spoken relic from a quieter time. But those who knew Lancaster or studied him deeply will tell you something very different, that the most fascinating part of his life was never on the screen. It was what he never said, never revealed, and never let slip, even when he had every opportunity to come clean. He was a man of contradictions, a progressive who worked behind the scenes to support civil rights while still navigating the brutal politics of a segregated industry, a champion of truth on camera, who protected some of Hollywood's darkest secrets in real life, a fierce protector of the vulnerable in public, while carrying the weight of his own silence behind closed doors. He named enemies, but only in whispers. He acknowledged rumors, but only through the characters he played. And he told stories, but always left out the parts that might have exposed too much. He was always performing, even when the cameras stopped rolling. That's what makes Lancaster so haunting. Unlike some stars who faded into caricatures of themselves or fell from grace and scandal, he maintained control until the very end. No arrests, no breakdowns, just a slow, calculated withdrawal from the public eye. He died as he lived, keeping just enough hidden to make people wonder. And maybe that was the point. Maybe Lancaster knew that mystery was more powerful than confession, that ambiguity, especially in a town obsessed with image, could outlive even the harshest truth. Because if he had said everything about Hollywood, about himself, about the names he reportedly hated, it wouldn't have changed the past. It would have just made him another casualty of the machine he'd survived for decades. So instead, he chose legacy. He chose silence. And in doing so, he left behind a version of himself that people could project onto hero, villain, victim, myth. The files? The letters? The rumored recordings? Maybe they're real. Maybe they aren't. But their existence, or the mere suggestion of it, is part of the legend now. Because in the end, Burt Lancaster didn't just act in movies. He directed his life like a slow burn noir, layered, stylish, conflicted, and deeply, deliberately incomplete. And that's the question he left for us all. When the spotlight fades and the masks come off, what's left? The truth? Or just the version of ourselves we want the world to remember? Burt Lancaster's revelations remind us that Hollywood's golden glow often masked a darker reality. The actors he named weren't just stars. They were shadows behind the spotlight. As the myths fade, the truths linger, challenging us to see beyond the surface.